Dear students, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome in the session. Today we will discuss New Classical Realism, its intervening variables. It is chapter 3 and its book is written by three scholars. The title of the book is New Classical Realist Theory of International Politics. New Classical Realist Theory of International Politics. Its authors are Norrin M. Ripsman, Jeffrey W. Taliaferro, and Stephen E. Lobel. Stephen E. Lobel. These are the three authors. They are co-authors of this book. It is published by Oxford University Press, and the book was published in 2016. New Classical Realism, Intervening Variables. So there are several types of variables. Generally, we discuss them in research methodology. Have you studied research methodology? Your class? Not yet. You have not studied the course research methodology. Okay, I think in the coming semester you will study this course. It is very important course, research methodology. In this course, you will learn there are independent variables, there are dependent variables, and then there are intervening variables. Okay. For example, classical realists explain that since people are selfish and greedy, and that the states comprise of the citizens, that is why their foreign policy, their external behavior is greedy and selfish. Foreign policies pursue power politics, national interest. So here, what is the independent variable? The citizens, the characteristics of the citizens, internal characteristics of the state are the independent variable, and external behavior or foreign policy, that is the dependent variable. So according to the classical realism, foreign policy or external behavior of a state is depends upon the characteristics, internal characteristics of a state. So internal characteristics are independent behavior, and external character behavior is the dependent variable. If you say the if someone has higher education, his or her income is likely to be higher. The income is likely to be higher. So what is the independent variable here? What is the independent variable and what is the dependent variable? Yes, education is independent variable because income is depending on the level of education. So income is the dependent variable. Now, there can be some intervening variables which become between the independent and dependent variables. Those variables are called intervening variables. Okay. So, for example, we can say since a person who has higher education has more skills, for example, has more knowledge, more skills, and those skills and that knowledge helps the educated person, highly educated person, to earn more. So we can say the higher level of skills or multiple level of skills or more knowledge, that can be taken as the intervening variable. Higher education leads to more skills, higher education leads to more knowledge, and more skills and more knowledge lead to more income. So this way you can understand independent variables, dependent variables, and intervening variables. So here in New Classical Realism, the scholars, the theorists, they focus on intervening variables. Uh, Intervening variables mean there are dependent and independent variables, and among them, between them, these variables are important. We discuss four broad categories of intervening unit level variables in this chapter. So, major units of the international system are states. So, that is the unit level, state level. These categories are: number one, the images and perceptions of state leaders. Images and perceptions of state leaders. Who are state leaders? Anyone can explain? Presidents, prime ministers, foreign ministers, senior bureaucrats. These are the state leaders, army chiefs, military leaders, senior politicians. They are the state leaders, and their perceptions and their images. People have a world view. They have an image of the world. They have image their own self, image of their own state, image of other states. For example, Pakistan have a certain image of India. You're getting the point? When we think of India, a certain image comes to our mind. When we think of Saudi Arabia, China, there is a different image which comes to our mind. Okay, so we have different images of different states, different international actors. Similarly, we have a different of the United Nations in an image. We have an image of the IMF, for example. But the image that we have of India, of China, of Saudi Arabia, of IMF, of the United Nations, do you think a British or an American would have the same image of these entities that we have? No, their image is likely to be different. Similarly, an Indian may have and is likely to have different image of these entities. So different people have different images of international actors. So they are important. Those images, they influence the foreign policy making, external foreign policy, when external behavior, it influences their external behavior, their external policy, their foreign policy. The images and perceptions of state leaders. Number two, strategic culture. Strategic culture. What strategy a certain nation has? And strategy has different aspects. There is an economic strategy, there is a cultural strategy, there is a military strategy, then there is a total strategy. Fine. So there are various aspects of strategy. So, but military strategy is not the total strategy. It is only one aspect of strategy. Military strategy is only one aspect of strategy. To pursue the national interest, to pursue the national goals, nations, countries, they have various aspects of strategy. So, strategic culture. What strategies are preferred? What strategies are employed? Okay, what strategies dominate in a state, in a country? That is called the strategic culture. Strategic culture. Number three is state-society relations. State-society relations. Society means citizens, we, people, common people who live in a state. So what is the relationship between the state and the citizens? That is called state-society relations. It is the third set of third set of intervening variables. Number four, domestic institutional arrangements. Domestic means national level, within the state. Within the state, domestic. Domestic institutional arrangements. What kind of institutions exist within a state? and how those institutions are linked, connected. What is the relationship among those state institutions? Institutions at the top, there are three: the legislature, the executive, the judiciary. Then within the executive branch, there are several institutions. Okay, even within the legislature and judiciary, they can be different institutions. But executive is the largest branch of government. It deals with all the affairs of the state. There are different ministries and departments. So uh, the institution of military, it comes under the Ministry of Defense. Ministry of Defense is a branch of the executive. So there are educational institutions, there are health institutions, fine. There are the police institutions, there are the intelligence institutions, there are the financial institutions. So there are many types of institutions that exist in different states. So domestic institutional arrangements. So this set of intervening variables also refer to the constitution. Actually, basically, constitution explains what kind of major institutions there have to be in the state, and what will be their powers and functions, and how will they relate to each other. The constitution basically explains these things, these relations, these structures, institutions. So domestic institutional arrangements also refer to the constitutions of the states. These variables include psychological models, bureaucratic and organizational models, societal models, and institutional models. These models reflect different approaches to foreign policy analysis. These are models of foreign policy analysis. And these models reflect different approaches to foreign policy analysis. They reflect the various constraints on the central actors, top leaders. They also between decision makers and society as a whole. Interactions, how people and their leaders interact. Okay. These models also reflect the interactions within and between decision makers and society as a whole. Interactions between society and leaders, and interactions within the decision makers. For example, interactions between the foreign minister and the interior minister. For example, interactions between the foreign minister and the army chief. Okay. For example, the interaction between the army chief and the prime minister, and the president, for example, and the speaker. So these are also interactions within the policy makers, decision makers. They are also explained by these models. And the interactions within the society, among the society, within the society, there are various actors. In the society, you have businessmen. In the society, you have religious elites. In the society, you have intellectual elites. In the society, you have human rights activists, for example. So how do they interact with each other at the societal level? They are also explained by these models. And they reflect the processes and mechanisms by which foreign policy is formulated. The processes and mechanisms by which foreign policy is formulated. Each of these can affect the manner in which states respond to external stimuli. There are external stimuli, there are external pressures or external favors to a state, external demands or external offers. And how does a state respond to those external stimuli? These models also explain. Each of these can affect each of these interactions, they can affect the manner in which states respond to external stimuli. By organizing these variables into four categories, we argue they represent the central intervening variables. They represent the central intervening variables. We are moving away from the eclecticism which characterizes the current state of type 1 and type 2 neoclassical realism. So, before this work, before this book, which was published in 2016 by these three scholars, there were two types of neoclassical realism, type 1 and type 2. What is type 1? Type 1 means neoclassical realism as a guide to explaining anomalies. Anomalies. Uh, there were anomaly means which is not according to the rule, which is irregular. Something irregular is called anomaly. So this type of neoclassical realists, they identified the anomalies in classical realism and new realism. They identified, they understood, they explained the irregularities in the classical realism and the new realism. So it became type 1 of new classical realism. What is type 2 of new classical realism? A theoretical approach to explaining foreign policy. Type 2 new classical realism is a theoretical approach to explaining foreign policy. The authors of this book, they say, we term our model as type 3. This model is type 3, in which we study intervening four sets of intervening variables. Neoclassical realism or neoclassical realist theory of international politics. This is type 3. These intervening variables can affect a state's foreign policy responses. These intervening variables can affect a state's foreign policy responses. This is especially true under the conditions of a permissive strategic environment. Permissive strategic environment. Permissive strategic environment means when there are not much pressures on a state. It means the state has more leverage, more options to respond to the external stimuli. However, even in the most restrictive environment, these intervening variables can still influence the policy selection process. So, restrictive strategic environment means when there are more pressures on a state, when the foreign policy options are limited. It is restrictive strategic environment, restrictive strategic international environment. Even in the most restrictive environment, these intervening variables can still influence the policy selection process. They can influence it from a narrow range of policy alternatives. They can influence the foreign policy process from a narrow range of policy alternatives. Policy alternatives can be narrow. There may not be a wide range of alternatives or options. There may be few options. So these intervening variables, they can influence the foreign policy making when there are limited options. They can also influence policy implementation. So the intervening variables, on the one hand, they influence policy making, foreign policy making. On the other hand, they also influence foreign policy implementation, enforcement of foreign policy. One criticism has been leveled against neoclassical realism. There are criticisms against neoclassical realism. Critics say that its intervening variables have been chosen in an ad hoc manner. Critics say that its intervening variables have been chosen in an ad hoc manner. It is one of the criticisms against neoclassical realism. We are on slide 23. They also say that these variables can only account for specific foreign policy decisions. The critics. The critics also say that these variables can only account for specific foreign policy decisions. So the critics are pointing to the limitations of neoclassical realism. The limitations of neoclassical realism. For instance, Stephen Walt argues that neoclassical realism tends to incorporate domestic variables in an ad hoc manner. So there is ad hocism. There is the intervening variables which have been selected by new classical realists, they are not selected according to any formula. They have been selected on ad hoc basis, randomly. So the critics say it is one of the weak points of new classical realism. Stephen Walt also says that its proponents have yet to identify when these variables will exert greater or lesser effect, when these intervening variables are more important in foreign policy making and implementation, and when these intervening variables are less important, less influential. The critics say neoclassical realists have not explained it properly. Moreover, critics have argued that neoclassical realists utilize too wide a range of unrelated intervening variables. So it is another criticism. The critics say the intervening variables are too many. Too many. There's a laundry list. Laundry list means when something is too much, more than required. They say this amounts to no more than a laundry list. They also argue that the incorporation of such unit level variables is inconsistent with the core assumptions of realism. So the critics also say these assumptions made by the new classical realists also challenge, also neutralize the core assumptions of realism. They say it is degenerating. The critics say new classical realism is degenerating. It has weakened the realist theory. It is the criticism against new classical realism. And they say it undermines its predictive power. Predictive power, the power to predict what will happen in future is called prediction. So the critics say the, uh, these intervening variables, they undermine the predictive power of realist theory. In this chapter, we explain systematically how we categorized the intervening variables that are used in new classical realist theory. So the authors say we have addressed these criticisms. They have addressed these criticisms and they respond to these criticisms in this book, in this chapter, and other chapters. We also explain when they can influence foreign policy. The authors of this book say we also explain when these intervening variables can influence foreign policy much or less, and when they can influence international outcomes. They also explain in this book. And when they can influence structural change, they can also explain the intervening variables of new classical realism. They can also explain when they can influence structural change. In particular, we link our four categories of intervening variables directly to the three domestic processes. Three domestic processes. The three domestic processes are number one, perception, number two, decision making, number three, policy implementation. These are the three domestic processes that take place within a state: perception, decision making, policy implementation. These three domestic processes can potentially distort national foreign policy responses to international systemic stimuli. Stimuli. The four clusters of intervening variables we identify all have a direct bearing on one or more of these processes. The four clusters, four groups of intervening variables all have a direct bearing, all influence one or more of these processes, these three processes: perception, policy making, decision making, and implementation. These are the three processes. So these intervening variables, they directly influence these three processes. They influence perceptions, they influence decision making, and they influence policy implementation. Perception is affected not only by international factors, it is also affected by leader images and strategic culture. Leader images and strategic culture. Both decision making and policy implementation are conditioned domestically. Conditioned domestically means domestic environment, domestic factors, they influence decision making, they influence policy implementation. They are conditioned by strategic culture, they are conditioned by state society relations, they are conditioned by domestic political institutions. Thus, rather than being ad hoc, we have organized the relevant domestic variables that are germane to neoclassical realist theory. So the authors of this book say the four sets of intervening variables that we identify, we have not identified them on ad hoc basis. We have organized the relevant domestic variables that are germane to neoclassical realist theory, that are relevant. We have organized them at unit level intervening variables. Unit level intervening variables. We have done this based on their respective pathways to political significance. Respective pathways to political significance. How much significance they carry, they have with reference to certain issues at certain occasions. Finally, addressing the critics of neoclassical realism, we also clarify an important point. We also clarify an important point addressing the critics of neoclassical realism. Addressing the critics of neoclassical realism, we also clarify an important point. We explain when different intervening variables can influence the authors of this book explain when different intervening influence the dependent variable. We further show that these influences can vary in degree over time. These influences of various intervening variables, they can vary in degree over time. We are on slide 48, 49. For instance, leader perceptions will have significant influence in the short run. Leader perceptions will have significant influence in the short run. They will influence foreign policy decision making during crisis situations. When there is a crisis, leaders have to decide urgently. They have limited time to decide. So they cannot consult with many other stakeholders. So it means in the crisis situation, the top leaders have more influence over foreign policy. So they will influence foreign policy decision making during crisis situations. Our rationale is as follows. The authors of this book, They explain it further. When facing time constraints, when there's not much time and the decision has to be made immediately, the foreign policy executive is usually separated from the body of the bureaucracy. For example, the president or the prime minister or the foreign minister has to make a quick decision. So there's no time to consult with the bureaucrats. So here, the foreign policy maker has more influence on foreign policy decisions. They are also separated from society and domestic institutions as a whole. Similarly, they cannot ask the people what people think about it. No, they have to make a decision quickly. Time constraints play an important role in crisis decision making. Time constraints play an important role in crisis decision making. Secrecy also strongly influences the process. Secrecy is important. Sometimes some of the decisions cannot be made public, they have to be secret. High stakes create additional pressures on decision makers. High stakes. Some of the decisions are very important. They can lead to some disasters. Some of the decisions can lead to some good fortune for the nation, for the country. But some decisions can lead to dangerous results. So here, the in this such a situation, the stakes are high. High stakes create additional pressure on decision makers. So in these situations, the decision makers face huge pressure. Because of these factors, other intervening variables have less opportunity to operate. As a result, they have limited influence on the processes and mechanisms of decision making. Slide 59. These other intervening variables include state society relations and possibly even domestic institutions. These other intervening variables include state society relations and possibly even domestic institutions. Alternatively, strategic culture and especially state society relations and domestic institutions are about domestic processes. These variables address what the process looks like. They address the autonomy of leaders and the constraints under which they operate. These sets of intervening variables address the autonomy of leaders and the constraints under which they operate. They address their socialization. They also explain their socialization of the leaders. They address domestic distributional competition, domestic at the national level, within the state, distributional competition. There's a competition among the citizens, among the various stakeholders, uh, how state resources should be distributed, how national wealth should be distributed. So this is called distributional competition. And they address the mechanisms through which differences are resolved. They explain the mechanisms, they explain the ways through which differences among the stakeholders are resolved. These process variables are likely to have more influence in the short to medium term, in the short term and in the medium term, and the medium term to long term. These process variables are likely to have more influence in short, medium, and long terms. While uh, in the crisis, in the short term, top leaders have more influence in the crisis situation. This is when culture, society, and institutions shape and constrain the formulation of policy planning and strategy. In normal situations, these other sets of variables they are more important, they are more influential in foreign policy making. Thus, these process variables demonstrate that neoclassical realism is much more than simply accounting for instances of pathological foreign policy. So, type 1 neoclassical realism explain only the weak points. Okay, the what was that word? Here it is used, as I said, pathologies, pathological foreign policy, deviations, there were irregularities. The type 1 new classicalism explains irregularities. So, and pathological pathologies in the foreign policy explanation. So, but the authors of this book, they claim their variables, process variables, they explain much more than type 1 or type 2 new classical realism. It is also more than just accounting for the problems that leaders face in assessing and adapting to systemic shifts and changes. It does not only explain the challenges, the problems that leaders face, it explains much more than that, their new classical realism. So, with this, thank you.